company in the United States. We have 10 locations across the country and operations in low Earth orbit and across the solar system. So I'm going to come at this from a little different perspective than what you've been hearing so far today, and you'll hear tomorrow as well. And I'm going to give you a little bit of an update of how the space industry is changing, not just in the US, but globally, and how that is going to affect many businesses, not just ones based in space, but here on Earth as well. So I work in our human spaceflight group. I manage the technologies and systems to keep astronauts alive and send them to incredible destinations across the solar system. But when people think about human spaceflight, they think about Apollo. So this is an iconic image from a famous photographer taking a picture of Buzz Aldrin walking down the steps for the lunar landing. But this was what space used to be like for human spaceflight. It was a sortie, it was a short duration mission, it was done for very specific reasons, beating our Russian colleagues to the surface and kind of a technology achievement to kind of show the prowess of the United States' technical capabilities. It's completely different than where we are at today. So space today, fast forward, we have an International Space Station operating over 16 years, built by an international collaboration from around the world. We have launches going off from every major developed country around the world, developing cargo and crew. We are building an infrastructure within the US to now commercially launch cargo and crew, also to the space station. By the way, the image that you're seeing here is not a simulation. This is an actual real image from the space station taking video of the world, of the fragile planet we live in. So I'd like to think and remind folks of, we don't see borders in space. You don't see a single border in many of these areas. You see the beautiful auroras here, and you see that very thin line, which is our atmosphere, of why the very small protection that we have from us to space itself. But the industry is changing very rapidly. You hear in the common press of now NASA competing with the private sector. And I'll give you a little bit of an eye-opening experience of it's not really competing, it's us working in collaboration with that global economic sector of growth. So a couple examples. We're seeing a resurgence of actually launch capabilities, commercial launch opportunities, domestically and around the globe. This is reducing our cost to orbit, which is then opening up new markets of satellites being delivered to low Earth orbit in a price point that has never been able to be done before, which then enables satellites to acquire data that we've never been able to do before, because now the price point of getting to launch and then actually building satellites is so much lower than it was in the past. So I would say that we're at another version of a Sputnik moment. But instead of the Russians kind of surprising us and flying a satellite overhead, what we're at is a time and a crossroad where the new Sputnik is actually expansion of our economic ability to create revenues and business models actually into space. And instead of being surprised by it, there's a whole community that are actually leading that transition. So we're not waiting for some iconic speech from a president of one country, but rather we're relying on an entire world's industrial base to transform the economy where we're going. So it wouldn't be, in US policy, everybody asks the key question, does a president matter? And that's in the popular news these days as well. And one of the things of this expansion of economics into space has been showing us is it's actually president agnostic in some ways. So we've been under this kind of development curve for the past 2 presidents, and we'll continue into that as well. And expansion of this space economy is really critical for us. And one of the main reasons it's critical for us domestically is NASA's budget. So NASA's budget has been relatively stable, plus or minus $1 billion for most of this entire graph that you see on the top. But on the bottom, you see the function of percentage of the federal budget, or you can think about this as buying power. So we're seeing this reduction in buying power, or reduction versus GDP as well. If you look at the United States global budget, that purple line that you can see on the left, but you can't see on the right, shows our budget over as a function of our total expenditures within space as a government activity. And what I'd like to say is this is not a bad thing, because it's no longer solely about what the government wants to do, but it's about what industry and entrepreneurs want to do as well. So we have this budding global space sector that's out there. So it's not only the launch providers that you see and hear about in the news. Everybody likes the smoke and fire of rockets. It's not just the builders of satellites. It's the producers and users of services and those things that come from those data that are being collected on orbit that are going to be incredibly important and change the entire economy, not just for space, but many other business sectors as well. To put it in perspective, this is the global spending, about $80 billion globally that governments spend on space activities, half of which is in the United States, the half is the rest of the world combined. It seems like an astronomical number, and you've got to wonder, why would you spend $80 billion as government activities across the world? The reason is the government spending is 25% of the global space sector. The global space sector is over $320 billion around the world, and the government spending is less than 25% of that. It's broken out into things like satellite services, satellite manufacturing, launch, ground equipment, and non-satellite industry activities. And you're seeing this entire sector that is basically initially brought to us by government expenditures in R&D, but now expanding into commercial activities around the globe. You're seeing the bread and butter of what used to be our exploration programs and our commercial activities and commercial telecom satellites. For the past 4 decades, commercial communication satellites have been the only for-profit revenue-generating activity in low Earth orbit and in geosynchronous orbit as well. But now you're seeing an emergence of Earth observation, the EO and metrology data, of weather data, also now very quickly catching up to the same amount of spending and economic activity as telecommunications. You're also seeing now commercial satellite future use now closely coming up to what the government has been spending and will soon surpass it as well. This is a map of the next 2 decades of satellites being produced and what would have been done and what will be coming in the next couple years as well. Interesting enough, Australia is blank on there, which I think is going to change here very soon by a couple Australian companies that are launching satellites. I mean, this does not include the entire small satellite revolution, which is literally tens of thousands of planned satellites in the next decade. This Earth observation phenomena is, I would say, probably the biggest change in the space economy. Today, Earth observation has been a product of governments, the military and things like Landsat in the United States for civilian use. But it's going to quickly become a product of commercial endeavor. This is a list of a whole series of operational companies and planned companies and the type of imagery that they're doing for Earth observation. These are data sources that will be available commercially. Companies like Planet Labs or Planet.com that is going to globally raster scan the planet every day at 3 meters per pixel. If you could look at every single place on Earth at 3 meters per pixel and understand every single change that's occurring everywhere in the world, it's no longer a satellite company. It's probably the world's largest data company. And that's what these companies are doing. And they're just one example. Spire up there as well is also doing ship tracking data, and in fact launched 4 satellites actually just yesterday, I believe, off the International Space Station cargo vehicle that we just delivered up there. So you're seeing this whole shift in Earth observation and understanding the planet that we have from a scientific point of view, and now commercial exploitation, which will be literally Earth-changing in every single business activity that goes on Earth as well. Because of that, you're seeing a whole host of space companies emerging in different discipline areas, everything from normal satellite manufacturing to even in-space mining activities. And so you see this huge growth rate. You see key events in here of SpaceX coming into being a commercial entity and the price reduction that launch will provide in opening up new markets as well. So for us at NASA, then, it means that we're going to change the way we do business, and we have been changing the way we're doing business. So we've been talking about going on a journey to Mars, sending humans out into deep space further than we've ever gone before. We're well underway of building a new launch capacity, both commercially and at NASA as well. We're developing new crew vehicles to get people to and from space, and we're actually building the habitats, or for the first time, spaceships to take humans beyond low Earth orbit, back and first in orbit around the moon, and then all the way out to Mars. We're evolving the way we work with industry. Most of this is archaic kind of business and acquisition, procurement, and legalese up here. But what the bottom line of this chart is we no longer pay an industry that doesn't support something else. We know an industry is supporting this huge commercial market, so we change the way we engage with them. We buy services. Who would have thought 15 years ago that we could buy commercial cruise services, not all that unlike buying an airline ticket? Hopefully it'll be a little more pleasurable than some of our airlines these days. But we are doing exactly that. We're buying fixed price contracts to deliver crew to and from low Earth orbit for the space station, and eventually evolving that into commercial space stations in low Earth orbit. So we engage with industry in different ways. We talk about how to actually build this industry, how to collaborate with this industry, both in transportation, in exploration, and in research. We engage them through a whole host of solicitations or procurements that we do at NASA, and now the global space community is doing as well. We've done interesting things that even 7 years ago, we bought the first in-orbit water production service. So we put out a contract that said, we don't want a piece of hardware, although that's what you see in the picture here. We want the ability to produce water on orbit. I will give you CO2, I'll give you power, and I'll give you thermal control. You give me a piece of hardware that produces water, and I want to pay for it like I pay for my home telephone, meaning when I go to use it, I expect it to work. If it doesn't work, I don't pay. And that's exactly what we did. So we actually did the first in-orbit production service contract that had ever been done in space. Explaining that to our NASA lawyers was a lot of fun. And what service contracts mean when you don't have a service provider that can come fix a machine and those kind of things. But fast forward, it operated on orbit for 5 years, its first 5 years of life. It was actually only down for 4 days in 5 years. I don't even think my home television works that reliable some days. And it was the most successful piece of life support equipment that we've ever flown for humans. We're now parlaying that into cargo delivery. This has been in the news a lot in the US and around the globe. We have commercial cargo contracts with Orbital, Sierra Nevada Corporation, and SpaceX. They're delivering cargo to and from the space station on a fixed price basis, meaning if their rocket blows up, we don't pay, and they give us a new rocket and we go fly the hardware again, which has been put into practice, as you may notice, in a few of our failures that these companies have seen. But what you see is a robustness of the marketplace occurring that in past years when we had a rocket failure, it would be 2 or 3 years before we could actually go start flying again. These folks, we don't see that 2 or 3 years, we see 2 or 3 months, and we're back flying and operating in orbit again. Fast forward to today, we have commercial crew flights under development today with Boeing and SpaceX. And then we also have not contracts in place, but we are encouraging the industry sector to continue their development with Sierra Nevada and Blue Origin. So we actually have contracts for Boeing and SpaceX today, and they will start launching crew and crew flights in 2 short years from now. Next year, you'll see the test flights of their new crew vehicles for both Boeing and SpaceX to deliver crew to the space station. Well, we need some place to go once the space station is done. So how do we build the next generation space stations, commercial space stations? Something that's not the size of the International Space Station, but how do we encourage companies to go do that? And how do we look at new materials to build space stations out of? So we partnered with a company called Bigelow Aerospace and did the first expandable structure on board the space station. It's 16 cubic meters in volume. It was packed in a SpaceX Dragon trunk. The reason why it's the size it was is that's what fit, to be honest. They said, we're going to make it as big as we can and still fit in the SpaceX Dragon trunk to deliver it. If it's successfully expanded out, this is what it looks like with 6 crew members inside. 16 cubic meters of volume, and it's the first soft goods structure that we've ever flown in space that's been human certified. And these are materials that we're looking at for next generation space stations of things that could be extremely large. Bigelow has commercial plans that in 3 launches, they could have a space station larger than the International Space Station is today, all commercially. So this is an interesting development that's kind of coming along as we speak today. We're also working with industry, everybody from suit designs to modifying how ULA, or United Launch Alliance, works, looking at satellite servicing, and SpaceX with their Mars exploration plans as well. We're expanding commercial markets into how do we commercially land payloads onto the moon. So there's a lot of talk about NASA's not going to the moon, which is a true statement. US industry is going to the moon. Internationals are going to the moon, and we are enabling US industry to actually create landed services for the moon. So if you wanted to go land a payload to the moon for whatever reason you need to, in a couple short years, and in fact right now, you can sign contracts to commercially deliver a payload to the surface of the moon at a fixed price per kilogram, which had never existed in the past. We do this in a whole host of other areas, in habitation and propulsion systems, CubeSat development, these kind of miniaturized satellites for a bunch of commercial applications, and how we're trying to advance those for use in deep space and long duration. One of the key things that we're doing today is we're actually building the habitats that will take us into deep space. So we have 6 contracts you see in the left-hand corner there. We're actually building the prototypes, and the prototypes will be complete in 2018. And this will be the prototype of a habitat, or rather a spaceship, that will actually take us anywhere we want in the solar system. We're engaging with industry of how to move advanced and additive manufacturing into space by actually now in development with industry, building the first fab lab, full-up fab lab for the space station. We've been operating commercial printers for the past couple of years on board the space station, and now we're moving into a full-up fab lab of what we need to be able to do in space. So a lot of this is about what we're doing, and I wanted to talk about an opportunity for Australian-based companies to utilize some of these things that are emerging. And one of the ones that I wanted to highlight is a company called NanoRacks. So NanoRacks is a US commercial entity that it has a partnership with NASA, and it can actually conduct experiments on board the International Space Station. So they have a whole host of platforms called Nano Labs, and they have a plate reader, and they have even educational tools like MixSticks, where they actually can fly payloads up to the International Space Station on a commercial basis for whatever commercial idea that you may have. If you want to utilize the space environment, the removing of gravity to understand fundamental physics of materials, you can do those types of experiments. If you want to do biological samples and you want to actually do a full processing with a plate reader, 92-well plate reader like you do in a common lab here, you can do that on orbit as well. In addition to that, we even have DNA sequencing on board the space station, so we can understand fundamental DNA changes of any biology that's done in space. Interesting little bits of information related to biology. If you look at virulence of any kind of bacteria here on Earth, and you run an experiment to cause it to react, you might get 900 gene expressions. Gene expressions are interesting because then you can understand what the fundamental modes and implications are to things like immune response and those kind of things. You do the same exact experiment in space. You don't get 900 gene expressions, you get 15,000 gene expressions. The only thing that's changing is the absence of gravity. So in your science classes, it's very important that we've always had this gravity as a constant, and that's a restriction on our ability to discover how actual organisms are working and how materials interact. And using the International Space Station as a platform to understand that, we're actually making huge leaps in immune response and the ability to actually create universal vaccine methodologies, all utilizing the International Space Station. So in addition to that, there's CubeSat deployments that you can buy commercially today with rockets that are built around the world. You can also deploy off the International Space Station. So they offer as a deployment service a fixed price contract to deploy satellites. And in fact, that's what happened just last night on Cygnus. Cygnus was carrying 4 CubeSats on board on the outside of it. So after it undocked from the space station, it actually raised its orbit up to about 500 kilometers. And then it did a deployment of 4 satellites for a company called Spire, which is doing ship tracking as one of their primary business models that they have. You can actually put experiments on the outside of the space station as well to expose them or take imagery of Earth and actually test next generation sensors before you make an investment of putting it into a satellite. So all these are kind of commercial activities that are available to an international community today. And the bottom line is it's no longer about just a government agency going and doing really interesting science and exploration activities, which we are doing, but we're actually using space to actually expand our economic sphere of influence all the way out there and then open up huge new markets potentially of benefit to here from data that's received there, the scientific environment that we have. And all this we're actually including humans in. So people ask, well, why send humans? And the question is, why only send robots? So robots and humans can both explore, but only humans create economies. So we're looking at how does human spaceflight drive economic development more than just robotic exploration for these activities. So with that, I wanted to just give you guys a snapshot of how the space economy is changing, the opportunities that are out there, and open your eyes to a whole new data sources that are going to be coming in the next years to come, and see how you guys here in Australia can exploit them. So thank you.